This happened back in the early 1960s. My family at the time lived in a very rural West Virginia area. We also had a very big family as well. My mom was only one out of 12 kids. She grew up in an extremely rural shack with her extremely poor family. She got pregnant with me at a young age and got married to my father. My dad didn't really consistently work, so we didn't consistently have any money. We always had a place to live though, because one of my older brothers had an old house nestled into a holler that he let us rent from him. This was, of course, in an even more rural area. We lived out in the hills and up the roads that weren't even gravel at the time. They were all made out of dirt. It took nearly an hour's worth of driving just to get off the country roads and onto main ones. We normally didn't have a whole lot to do, especially when we were younger, and especially at nighttime. The house was an old house, but it did have some electricity. We didn't have a television, but we did have a radio, so a lot of the time that we were allowed to be up late, which was not very often, mind you. We were up listening to radio shows or baseball games. This happened one summer night, when we were all up late listening to the radio together. It was me, my 3 younger siblings, my mom, and my dad. I don't really know how late it was, because I was so young at the time this happened. One particular thing about this house was that it was set back about 100 feet into the holler. The living room window faced the front of the house and the driveway, so if someone were to pull into the driveway, we would either see the car pulling in during the day, or we would see the headlights pulling in at night. On this particular night, I think we were all very surprised to see headlights showing that a vehicle was now pulling into our driveway. My dad got up and walked to the window and very briefly looked out it. We kept a shotgun sitting by the front door at all times. My dad was generally a very suspicious man, but he didn't reach for his gun yet. That indicated to us that maybe he knew who it was who was coming to the door. If he hadn't known who it was, he would have also told us kids to go into the bedroom at the back of the house. It only took him a moment before he opened the door. It was his younger brother, my Uncle Bill. At first, we began to relax. It had been weird seeing someone pull up to the house so late at night. But we always enjoyed seeing Uncle Bill. The feelings of relaxation didn't last very long, however. I guess we couldn't tell exactly what Bill was really upset about at the time, but even as younger kids, we could tell immediately that something was off. This was confirmed when our father suddenly told all us kids to get up right away and go to the back room of the house. Before we went, I saw something else. There was a new pair of headlights shining through the front window of our home. Another car was on its way down our driveway. As we ran to the back room of the house, we heard our dad growling at his brother. "Why the hell did you come here?" Although we were rushed into the back room, it was possible to hear some of what was going on outside. The other kids were even more terrified than I was. I was trying my best to keep everyone calm. At the same time, I was also trying to hear what was going on outside. I heard the front door open and close. I was pretty sure that now my dad and probably my uncle were both outside. There was suddenly a lot of yelling, although I was unable to make out the exact words. I began to wonder why my mother hadn't come back to check on us yet, because it was obvious that something really bad was going down. I figured she was probably watching everything from the front window. All I could hear now was yelling from many different people. I couldn't make out exactly what anyone was saying. I was trying my best. It was then that I heard a howl of pain, and I heard my mom scream. Immediately after, I heard a shotgun blast ring out in the night. There was more yelling and screaming, and the other kids, who had been doing their best to remain calm, began to completely freak out. I had to do my best to calm them down in this situation. However, I was able to make out the fact that I heard a car pulling quickly out of the driveway. There were more noises, and I heard someone rushing into the house. This worried me. I wondered if whoever had pulled up had shot my dad, and that's why my mom had screamed. I was worried they were going to hurt my mom and then come after us as well. This continued until the door opened, and thankfully it was my mother at the door. She ordered us all into bed and didn't tell us a single thing about what happened. As the years passed by, I found out some, but not all, of the details that happened. My uncle had seemingly gotten into trouble with some guys for whatever reason, and he came to my dad to seek help that night. The guys had followed him to our house, and when confronted, one of them stabbed my uncle. This resulted in my dad firing his gun, which scared the people away. I was surprised to hear that he didn't actually kill anyone. The guys ran off, and my dad took my uncle to the hospital. I never did find out what my uncle had done that made the guys mad, but that doesn't matter to this story, I guess. Just being 7 years old, in an old house, hearing everything that went on, was the scariest thing I ever experienced. Because of an experience I had at a water park once, I won't even get into the water for any reason nowadays. In fact, I don't even really like taking a shower. I'll do it, of course, but I don't enjoy it very much at all. And there's no way at all I would ever take a bath again. I was 12 years old, and it was a very hot summer. I guess it probably wasn't anything like the hot summers we have now, but I remember it being pretty damn brutal for the time, especially because we didn't have any air conditioning. Going to the water park was going to be such an amazing treat, simply because it was a chance to have a completely nice and cool day. My mom, dad, older brother, and younger sister all went to the park together. It was a really huge one, with many different pools and slides and other such attractions. My sister was about 7 years old, so she stayed with our parents when they went to the more parental area of the pool. My brother was 15 at the time, and he went off to go find girls or something. So that meant I was left all by myself to find my own entertainment at the pool. I didn't really mind, however, as I was the bookish, nerdish type that usually preferred to be by myself anyway. I was a lot different than my brother, actually. He was the big, athletic type that had tons of friends. I was a smaller, nerd type who had many bullies. In fact, looking back at the behavior of many of the bullies who were in my school, it wouldn't surprise me today if they were serving prison sentences. I was often a victim of this, but more often I watched it happen to other people. Most of the bullies knew who my brother was, and he was a big guy who could easily beat the hell out of any of them, so they only messed with me when they could get away without being seen. I was having a good time going down the slides, but mostly I was spending a lot of time in the pools. I really wasn't that good of a swimmer at the time, you see. I could keep myself afloat at least, though, and I kept toward the side often to keep myself from going under. I don't know how much time had passed by. We had gotten there pretty early, but I knew it wasn't lunchtime yet at least. The sun was crawling higher up into the sky, and it was now beaming down pretty hard on me. I figured I would go and seek out my parents just in case it was time for lunch, but I wanted to go down one more water slide first. You know how kids are, one more time. So I climb out of the pool and make my way over to a slide. There was, of course, quite a bit of a line, as there was with every other slide. I didn't mind too much, though. I was already soaked and wet, so I was still pretty cooled off from the sun's rays. After a long wait, I finally got to the end of the line. When it was my turn, I was quite ready. I should mention that although I enjoyed the thrill of the slide, I was still a little bit frightened by it. I was frightened in the same way you would be with a roller coaster, though. I wasn't scared to go on them exactly. But I would always close my eyes whenever I did. So, I closed my eyes and slid down the water slide. I remember it pretty well because it was one that had all these twists and turns in it. With my eyes closed, I wouldn't have any idea when I was about to hit the water at the bottom. It made it so much more fun. I hit the water, and at first, I got that really great splash feeling that anyone who's ever gone down a water slide already knows about. Before I could get back up to the surface, though, I felt someone grab a hold of the back of my head. Whoever this person was, they were obviously far stronger than I was. At first, I thought it might be my older brother. He would sometimes be a bit of a bother in the way he would pick on me, but not really try to hurt me, you know? But if that were him, he would have let go after the initial grabbing. This person was not doing that. They held me down under the water, despite the fact I was now thrashing and trying to get away from them. I'd been under so long that I accidentally breathed in a little water even. I couldn't hold my breath any longer. It was one of the most painful experiences I'd ever had in my entire life. And that didn't exactly help me stay calm. It made me panic more and more as I thrashed around and inhaled even more water. At that point, everything got dark, and I was certain I was now drowning to death. The next memory I had was waking up in a hospital bed, actually. When I awoke, I was very confused. I didn't understand where I was, how I got there, or what was even going on. It took a while before the memory of going down the water slide and nearly drowning came rushing back to me. When it did, I began to panic once again. Thankfully, I calmed down. What happened is this bully named Dennis, who gave me some problems at school occasionally, just happened to notice me going to the top of the slide alone. So he got in the water and waited for me to come down, then held me underwater when I did. The lifeguards, which should have broken this up immediately, did not. That's why I was underwater for so long. Thankfully, they finally pulled their heads out of their asses and saved me from Dennis. Then one of them performed a rescue breathing on me. I have absolutely no memory to this day of surviving through that rescue breathing. Every horror fan knows, though, that if a lifeguard lets a young boy drown while he's being picked on by bullies and the lifeguard's not paying attention, they'll come back with a hockey mask for revenge. I don't know if I'll do that, though. I went to high school in the early 90s. I had actually switched many high schools because of complications with my family. I moved back and forth between my parents for a while, and they both tended to move quite a bit as well. Finally, though, when I was a junior, we were at a school where I could stay and graduate. I made an interesting and fairly large and diverse group of friends. I hung out with the punks, the alternative people. I was sort of just a plain cute guy, and I didn't really fit in with any group as far as image goes. You know, everyone had mohawks, spot clothes from Hot Topic. Everyone was just kinda different than me. I was very plain, so I felt like I had to develop an alternative personality as well. Now, I know nowadays that there are a bunch of kids who dress goth-like and call themselves vampires. Back then, I also adopted a vampire persona, but it was not a bit like the ones of today. First, I didn't change my look at all. What I did do was tell stories, though. I had a really in-depth backstory about my life as a vampire. First, I went into the vampire lore to explain why I could spend time in the daylight. Vampires normally could be in sunlight, but their strength was sapped from them. They were stronger at night. I created this whole conflict as well between two groups of vampires called the Lamb and the Crow, and I was a member of the Crow. When my friends and I hung out after school talking, there was also this guy named Matt who was there with me. He was really fascinated by all the stories I came up with. I mean, everyone else accepted them as just something I talked about a lot of the time, but Matt was really fascinated. One time after school, my friend cut her hand and was bleeding a bit. She asked me if I wanted to drink her blood. Before I had any chance to react to this joke, though, Matt grabbed her hand and actually started sucking the blood from her wound. Afterward, he asked me if that would get him membership to the Crow. I was extremely weirded out. I still kept up my storyline, though. I told him that all vampires drink blood. Members of the Crow have to drink blood that's actually from a crow in front of another member. It seemed completely harmless to me at the time. That was until several days later, when my friend and I were hanging out in the school hallway. Matt came up to us, extremely excited, and told me that he had a big surprise for me. Matt reached into his backpack and pulled out the body of a dead crow. We were all shocked at first, but not as shocked as when he bit into the crow's neck and began to slurp and suck the blood out of its corpse. We all sat there in disgust and shock. Matt pulled his face from the crow. There was blood on his lips and dripping from his mouth. He was smiling so large like I had never seen anyone do before. "Am I in now?" Matt asked. I couldn't do anything but nod. It was the strangest and most bizarre thing I had ever seen, and I didn't know how to react. Matt was a junior too, but shortly after he was pulled out of school. He had always been a very smart guy. We were told he was going off to college early and skipping a high school graduation. I really hope that's true. He went really weird for a while, and it wouldn't surprise me if he ended up in a psych ward or something. Honestly, I feel a little guilty for starting the whole thing. No one but Matt ever took it seriously, and he took it very, very seriously, surprisingly so. The experience was so startling that I gave up on the whole vampire thing after. I did adopt a sort of psycho Hannibal Lecter thing for a while, but fortunately no one took that seriously enough to go and eat someone's face or something. Full disclosure, this happened 10 years ago, but I still can't believe how lucky I was to get away. I was 16 and female, and running late for school as usual. Walking down the road, I noticed a dark green car with tinted windows slowly following along behind me. This was a residential community, and it wasn't unusual for people to drive slowly because of this. It was around 9 a.m. or so on a weekday, so I naively figured there could be no danger in broad daylight as I hurried towards the bus stop. Arriving at the stop, it started to suddenly rain, so I decided to stand in the small glass bus shelter to wait for the bus. The creeping green car stopped right in front of me. The driver got out and approached me in the bus shelter. The bus shelter was so small, there was only room for 2 people. He stood in the entrance and grabbed each side, trapping me there. He was very large and extremely physically intimidating. Something about his dead eyes sent chills through my entire body. He asked if I was familiar with the area, and I responded that yes, I was. He asked if I was going to school, and I again responded yes, I was. He then asked if he could drive me there so I could show him the way. Call it intuition or whatnot, but something in my head was screaming not to get in that car with him. I politely declined his offer and asked if he needed some help with directions or something. Out of nowhere, he lunged at me. He grabbed my arm and began to pull me out of the bus shelter towards his car. I started screaming as he kept on insisting it would be faster to drive. By the grace of God, the bus pulled up at that exact moment. All my instincts told me to fight. I clawed at his face. I kicked him. I bit him. I contorted my body until he loosened his grip on my arm. Once free, I leapt on the bus as though my life depended on it. The bus driver asked if I was okay, but I was unable to reply. I ran to the back to find a seat I could hide in and cried quietly in the corner as the bus carried me off to school. All day I sat in class and said nothing about what happened to me. When I got home from school, though, I immediately told my parents what happened. They were of course horrified, especially after I showed them the big palm-shaped bruise from the man's hand on my arm. We contacted the police. The officer arrived later that evening and took my full statement. He said there had been several similar incidents in the area and asked if I could come to the station and look at some pictures to identify the culprit. The following week, my mom and I headed down to the station. The officer set up with a computer and we started to scroll through all these mug shots. There were so many. Not only was it discouraging to realize how many known sex offenders there were close by, but after a while, all the faces started to blur together. I was losing hope of identifying the guy. We were about to give up when I recognized those distinct dead eyes in one of the pictures. The officers asked if I was sure. I confirmed it was him, but he seemed to have grown a thick beard since the photo was taken. They thanked me and said they would call if needed. 2 weeks later, the news announced that the police had apprehended the man suspected of kidnapping and assaulting young girls in the area. The news story included his mugshot. It was the very same man I'd identified. He had been caught with an underage victim in his car. It took years for the gravity of this incident to truly hit me. Had the bus arrived a second later, had I not been able to twist myself out of his grasp, had he grabbed me while I was walking and didn't see him, things could have turned out very differently. I was very fortunate that day, but many others were not so lucky. This is an incident that occurred when I was around 9 years old. Even today, when I'm 34, I still think about what could have been. As a child, my parents both worked full-time, and sometimes they couldn't find or afford a babysitter, especially when I had winter, summer, or spring break. This meant I would be home alone until either one of them returned from work that day. There were two main rules they had whenever this happened. 1, never answer the door, and 2, don't ever play too close to the windows, because you never know who might be watching. I was 100% guilty of hanging out near the windows though. I liked the lighting, and I was a very bored kid. I mean, come on, no one had ever knocked on the door before while I was home alone. So, my father left for work that day, and went over the rules with me again. After a few hours of playing near the window as usual, all of a sudden, somebody knocked on the door. I froze. I knew not to answer at least. They knocked again. At this point in my tiny mind, I was thinking it had to be someone important if they were knocking twice. So I answered. I opened the door, and standing there was an intimidating-looking woman with a clipboard. She was wearing a hat with an American flag on it, very official-looking to a child. The woman asked me how old I am. I lied and said I was 12. She said she was from some institution I can't remember the name of, and told me, "You're a liar. You're home alone and that's illegal. You have to come with me now. Let's go." I started crying very loudly. I was scared my parents were going to get in trouble. After all, this woman was an adult. She must be right? In fact, I almost went with her, until I started crying even louder. A neighbor in our complex noticed what was going on and shouted at her. The lady all of a sudden told me, "Never mind, it's okay. You don't have to come with me. Just be quiet." She hurried off. At the time, my parents weren't doing so well financially, so we didn't even have a landline telephone. Cell phones? Certainly not in 1996. I couldn't call my family, and I couldn't call 911 either. I had to wait all day for my dad to come back home. I'm assuming the woman knew I was home alone because she'd been watching me through the window. I never really spoke on the incident much because I felt like it was my fault for breaking the rules. Nowadays, though, I often think about how lucky I am that I didn't leave with her that day. One of my favorite things to do was to go to my grandma's house in the fall of the year. This story takes place back in the 1980s or so, when I was around 13 years old. I lived in Virginia Beach, but my grandma at the time lived in rural Kentucky. So while I spent most of my time in the city, I enjoyed being out in the country whenever I could manage. I always had lots of fun climbing the hills and the trees that surrounded her house. We arrived late at night, so I couldn't go exploring for the first day that I was there. I was really eager to go out and do it the next day because of this. The adults always wanted us to be outside and away from them anyway. No one really cared that I and my cousin, who was also visiting, would go out and climb through the hills by ourselves. I had an uncle that was only a few years older than me. He used to try and scare us when we were younger and wanting to go exploring. He would tell us about all these vicious battles between American Indians and colonists in those hills. He made us believe that Indians were buried in shallow graves, and they would grab the feet of anyone who walked over their resting place and drag them to hell. That really terrified me when I was younger. The ground during this time was always covered in this huge blanket of leaves, so whenever we were out walking, I always half expected a hand to grab us from underneath. In fact, I even remember one time my brother, who was playing along with my uncle, once screamed that something had grabbed his foot and began screaming for help. While us younger kids had no interest in sticking around, we ran down the hill at the speed of light, screaming the entire way. Ah, the memories. Well, that was when I was a whole lot younger though. By the time this story happened, I didn't believe those sorts of things anymore. I had explored here, there, and everywhere on the hill since, and since nothing had happened to me, I knew it must just be a made-up story. My cousin Luke and I were the ones who went hill climbing on this day. We mostly had female cousins, and sometimes they would go climbing with us, but none of them wanted to come along this day. That was okay though. Luke and I didn't want to have to deal with watching the younger kids anyway. Plus, that meant we could explore deeper into the woods without them there. Soon we arrived to the top of the first hill, something we had done quite a lot. We climbed up a tree and looked around at the countryside. Most of the trees were without leaves at this time, so you could actually see pretty far out into the hills. Luke looked toward a certain direction and told me he thought we should go and see how far we could go that way. He felt like we would find something. It would surely lead us further into the hills than either of us had ever gone before. I agreed. We climbed down the tree and started down the hill. Once we got down, we immediately climbed over another hill. Halfway up, we decided to just walk along the side and see what we could find, as it was really tiring us out. I'm not sure how long we were out there. The woods could get really creepy in the fall. The sky was overcast that day, and the clouds were moving swiftly in the sky. Didn't seem to be much chance of rain, though. There was definitely a chill in the air, and it was enhanced every time the wind blew past. Eventually, we came upon a small creek. We decided to follow it, which is something we always did when we found a new water source. We likened it to a rainbow of exploration. If we followed the creek to its end, we would find a pot of gold, or at least something. Honestly, thinking back makes me feel pretty stupid, but hey, we were kids at the time. As we continued along, we saw a waterfall in the distance, so we decided to go check that out as well. As we got a bit closer though, we saw something extremely curious. There seemed to be a small, nondescript tent set up really close to the waterfall. Luke was really interested in this, and he wanted to go check it out. I told him I didn't think that was a good idea though. Someone was probably out camping, and they surely wouldn't like us disturbing them. He just couldn't be talked out of it though, and began walking in the direction of that tent. I followed him along the way, nervous about this, but not wanting to abandon him all to his lonesome. We arrived pretty close to the tent, but were still several meters away, when the flap to the tent just shot open. A grisly, dirty man with a matted beard and matted hair emerged from the tent. In his right hand was a huge machete, and he didn't look very happy to see us there. Luke stopped in his tracks. He slipped on the leaves and landed on his butt because he stopped so suddenly. I was scared. I thought the man was just going to kill him. The man was yelling some kind of gibberish at the both of us. We couldn't understand a single word he was saying, but I didn't really care. I could tell he was not meaning to welcome us. I meant to run and grab Luke, but fortunately he was able to get up to his feet on his own before the guy could get any closer. He ran towards me and grabbed me to run my butt off. I didn't need much convincing. The man coming after us would have already been terrifying, but it was even more so now that he had that machete on him. I turned and ran as fast as I could. The first time I looked back to see if the man was still chasing us, I could see him full-on sprinting towards us. I think that gave me a burst of speed to try and get away from him. I just kept running as hard as I could, avoiding trees and bushes, and hoping I wouldn't fall. It was a very long time before either of us dared to look back again. When we did, there was no sign of the scary old man nor his machete, but that didn't make us feel any more safe in these woods. We kept running until we got back to the hill that was right by my grandma's house. We told everyone what happened, and no one seemed surprised. We were told there were many people who lived out in the hills like that, and they told us the best thing you could ever do was to just leave those people alone. I was a latchkey kid growing up. Also, I was an only child, and both of my parents worked. My mom would always be home when it was time for me to go to school, but my dad would have already left for work in the morning. By the time I got home, both of them would still be at work. I would go into the house, lock all the doors, and then do my best to pretend I was not at home. I lived within town, so I didn't ride the bus to school. It was a decent walk there and back. Actually, my school had more children that walked than took the buses anyway. Because of this, there was generally a pretty big crowd of kids that gradually got sparser the further you walked along. Normally, about halfway through my walk back, I would be walking all on my lonesome. On this day, I was a little bit worried. When I'd walked to school, it was bright and sunny outside. However, 2/3 into the day, it started getting really dark outside suddenly. The wind picked up and was blowing hard through the trees. The clouds were black and green and moving swiftly through the sky. It was obvious that a thunderstorm was on its way. Still, it didn't start raining while I was at school. There was the occasional thunder and lightning though. I was really hoping it would just continue like this because I hadn't brought an umbrella or a raincoat to school that day, and I really hated getting rained on. After school, I began my long walk home. The wind was quite fierce, but that didn't really bother me. I could handle the wind. I just wanted to keep myself from getting completely soaked. I tried walking faster than I normally would, trying to arrive home as quickly as possible. About halfway there, though, this horrible siren began blaring in the air. I had heard this before, during tornado drills at school. We were taught that whenever you heard that siren, that meant a tornado was on its way. I was terrified. Getting wet was bad enough, but being caught out in the open in a tornado was even scarier. I was extremely frightened of tornadoes. I began running when I heard the siren. However, I was not in the best shape. I could only run so far before getting winded. Then I would try to run again after catching my breath. The siren began to blare through the whole town, and that was good enough motivation to keep going. I don't know what it was that caused me to turn my head in the moment, but at that exact moment I did, and as I did so, I saw the funnel touching down. I had never seen a real tornado in person before or since. If you haven't ever seen one, it fills you with a mix of awe and fear, and I felt both at the same time. The fear, though, was the biggest thing. I knew I had to get home right now. I tried my best to keep running. However, I kept looking to the side of me, fascinated by this tornado. As I ran, I kept wondering if it was moving toward me or not. I couldn't tell from the angle I was viewing it from. When I got home finally, I fumbled with my key to get the door open. Finally, I got it in and opened the door. Going in, I locked the door behind me. I knew I was supposed to head into the basement and do the duck and cover thing. That's what they taught us in the tornado drill back then, at least. I was only in the house for a few moments when I noticed something a different kind of scary altogether. The back sliding glass door had been shattered. Now, I know everyone tells you that you should open your windows during a tornado or the pressure will shatter them, but it didn't look like it was the tornado that had done it in. I mean, why would the one glass door be shattered and every single other piece of glass was fine? I walked into the house and over to the basement stairs, only to find the light in the basement was already on. I was sure my mom would have turned it off already. I was about halfway down the stairs and looking when I saw someone down there in our basement. Our basement was like our family room, with plenty of expensive entertainment equipment there. The man was obviously a burglar and was currently stealing from us. I didn't know what to do. I was stuck between this burglar and a tornado rapidly approaching. I mean, how could anyone have a worse day than that? I decided the burglar was not nearly as bad as the finger of God, though, and I ran down those stairs anyway. "Didn't you hear the tornado siren?" I yelled at the man. The burglar still hadn't noticed me, it seemed. He was shocked and moved toward me. "Take whatever you want," I told him. I ran to the corner and hid with my head beneath my hands. The burglar didn't get a chance to do much of anything, though. The tornado was close now, sounding like a freight train running through my house. And then I heard the sound of it eating my house, and that's a sound I cannot explain. You would have to actually be in this situation to ever understand what that means, and I truly hope that never happens to you. The things around me began crumbling apart and falling. I felt things smacking against me. The tornado ripped apart my house, tearing it into pieces. I half expected to get sucked up into it, but luckily I was not. It ripped apart my house above me and threw the rubble all around the neighborhood. Fortunately, I didn't get buried underneath anything. In fact, there didn't seem to be any major damage to the basement. Pieces of the ceiling fell in, but most of it didn't. As I looked around, though, that burglar was no longer anywhere to be seen. I had to wait in the basement for rescue workers to come get me out of there. The stairs led to nowhere. Interestingly enough, the burglar had run upstairs just before the tornado hit the house. He got buried underneath all the rubble and suffered some life-changing injuries. Luckily, he didn't die, though. He did go to jail when I explained to the firemen and police as to what happened. As for me, I had a laceration and a couple of bruises on my back from things hitting me. But otherwise, I was all right in the end. I had a really scary experience when I was a little girl, around the age of 8 years old. This might be a little intense, so please be warned about that ahead of time. An aunt of mine had her house burned down, and very unfortunately, she also died in the fire. However, the firemen were able to save my 6-year-old cousin. Of course, she experienced something that would disturb her for the rest of her life. My aunt had been a single mother. She hadn't seen or heard from the father in years, so he wasn't able to take custody of his daughter. For a while, she came to live with us. My mom thought that if she was with a girl of her age, it would help her get better. It was really hard living with her and trying to get her to do anything. I used to love tea parties and would hold them often. I couldn't really get her to take part in them at all, though. She would just, understandably, sit there silently and look sad. She rarely talked, and the only time she once did was to say, "That cup is empty," as if she didn't know we were supposed to just be playing. The girl slept in the same room as me, as I had 2 twin beds in the room. It was fine, and for the most part, she seemed to sleep well. Occasionally, though, she would have very bad nightmares and would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. My mom would always come to the room and grab her, hug her tight, and try to make her feel better. I have to admit, I didn't like having her around. At only 8 years old, I guess I couldn't really appreciate what she was going through. I feel really bad about that now, especially since I've never had to lose my mom. But something about her creeped me out. She was always so quiet, only communicating with people mostly with nods and shakes of the head. She would occasionally walk into the room and look around at everyone without coming in, and sit down in place. Then, after a while, she would turn around and leave without a word. It was kind of creepy. One time, my mom took us for a walk. We lived in a 2nd-story apartment. When we left the apartment, she stopped and looked at the window to it. I tried to get her to keep walking, but she didn't want to. My mom didn't notice at first, and didn't notice when I asked the girl what she was looking at. In a very rare moment of her actually talking, she told me, "Mommy is in the window." Of course, that chilled me, and I didn't want much to do with her. When my mom came over and told us to keep up, she went ahead and started walking alongside my mom. As I looked up at the window, though, I thought I saw a woman standing behind the sheer curtain. I felt my heart jump in my chest. I ran forward and grabbed my mother's hand. After that, I began to get a little bit scared of that house. I normally didn't, but that experience was enough to be pretty terrifying. The scariest thing, though, happened at night, and if I recall, it was about a week after what we saw in the window that day. My cousin and I were pretty soundly sleeping when I heard some sort of creaking noise that woke me up from my sleep. I looked over at my cousin's bed, only to notice that she was sitting up in it. She was rocking back and forth, and that was what was making the creaking sound. She was just doing it over and over again. I called out to her, trying to get her attention. However, she wouldn't respond to me in any way. She just kept rocking back and forth, staring at a certain area. I turned and looked to where she was looking at, only to realize that it was the bedroom closet door, and the door was wide open. We always kept the door closed when we were sleeping. I asked my cousin if she saw her mom in the closet again, remembering what she'd told me about last week. At first, she didn't respond, but when I asked her again, she turned and looked at me. "That's not my mommy in the closet," she told me. I looked back to the closet and saw the shadow of a person standing inside. I screamed for my mom at the top of my lungs. My mom rushed into the room and immediately turned on the lights. She saw that both of us girls were terrified and asked what was going on. I told her someone was hiding in our bedroom closet. My mom went in and searched, but somehow she didn't find anything. Both of us assured her that we'd really seen it though. My mom took us both into her room and let us sleep with her that night. Although we didn't sleep great, it was the only way either of us could have gotten any sleep at all. My cousin stayed with us for about another 3 months. After that, a paternal aunt asked my mom if she could take custody of the young girl. My mom was okay with that, mostly because the aunt was very wealthy and she thought she could provide a better life for her. I didn't see that cousin ever again. After she left, I didn't see any figures in the window either, or in that closet ever again. I went back to sleeping comfortably in my own room. I was around 12 years old when this happened. It was a Saturday morning, and my parents were going out of town for the weekend. They left my older brother to babysit, but as soon as they left pretty much, he did too. Yeah, great brother, I know. So I'm sitting there in the living room watching TV by myself when the doorbell suddenly rings. Instead of looking through the peephole like a normal person, I flung the door open, eager for company. I thought it would be my neighbor, not two middle-aged men I'd never seen before looking down at me. "Hi there, are your parents home?" I didn't even hesitate when I told them, "No, they're actually out of town for the weekend." Holy shit, if you could slap a child, I would go back and slap myself silly. They exchanged glances between each other when the older-looking man said, "Well, I'm your landlord. We need to come inside and check a few things out for a minute." And that's when I realized just how much trouble I was in. I knew my landlord personally. He was a friend of the family, and he was not either of the men standing before me. Thank God for some quick thinking, because I told them, "Yeah, alright, but I need to grab something first." Before they could reply, I slammed the door shut and deadbolted it. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed my mom's number. I remember crying, thinking, "Please pick up, please." When she did, the second I heard her voice, I broke down sobbing. "There's 2 guys at the front door and they want to come in. One of them said he's the landlord, but it's not Mario and I'm scared. Come home now." I heard pounding begin on the window. My mom must have heard it too, because next thing she said to me was, "Dad's on the phone with the police right now. You need to tell them that. Shout at the top of your lungs that the cops are on their way. They know you're home alone and they need to know you won't be for long. I'll be there soon." My parents were an hour away. How they made it home as fast as they did in 20 minutes, I'll never know. Through my tears, I yelled to the men as loud as I could that the cops were on their way. Hey, we weren't gonna hurt you. No need to cry. It's okay. We'll leave." Then there was silence. It seemed like a lifetime, but it was no less than 10 minutes later when the police arrived. I'll always remember the female officer who spoke with me that day. She calmed me down and applauded my quick thinking on shutting the door. She told me to never open the front door again unless it was someone I knew, and even then not to do so if I was home alone, which I wasn't for a very long time after. My parents pulled into the driveway like a bat out of hell, and my mom hugged me tighter than she ever had before. I was crying, she was crying. I got a big lecture on opening the door for strangers and how lucky I was to be alive. My brother got an even sterner scolding and got grounded as well. Not that he cared much. He moved out shortly after. The cops took a report and surveilled the area for the 2 men, but they never did find them. I learned my lesson that day. I have no idea who they were or what their true intentions were, but I don't care to ever find out. My high school had this building that was closed down. We called it the old building, even though it really wasn't any older than any of the other buildings on campus. For some strange reason, though, it was always closed down. The doors were all boarded up, and the students were forbidden to try and get into that building at all. The story that was passed down along all the students was that there was an old janitor named Mabel. He was a guy who worked in the old building. He was working late in the building one night when an escaped lunatic broke into the school. The lunatic supposedly killed Mabel by drowning him in the toilet. Afterwards, he took a hacksaw and hacked Mabel up into tiny pieces, then flushed him down the drain. Afterwards, they closed the building down because they didn't think it was right having children be taught in the same building in which such a brutal murder had taken place. Of course, as you might know, with urban legends, it doesn't just stop there. You know how kids are, not exactly original. There was this idea that if you went into one of the bathrooms in the old building and made sure all the stall doors were closed, then said Bloody Mabel 5 times in the mirror, Mabel would climb out of the toilet and murder you, then drag you down the drain. Of course, we knew the story was not true, but guys would often dare each other to go into the old building and do this little ritual. Of course, the day came along that I was dared as well by some old rivals of mine to break into that old building and try the ritual out. Unbeknownst to the faculty, the students had long discovered a way of getting into the old building through a busted window. Pretending to be brave, but actually being quite nervous, I climbed in through that broken window. The old building seemed a lot like any other abandoned building you'd see around. It was quite unkempt in there. There was tons of graffiti all over the walls. Now, the lore was that you were supposed to find the boys' bathroom on the east end of the bottom floor. It wasn't very difficult to find, actually. There was a ton of Bloody Mabel graffiti on the wall. Well, as much as I could see with my small flashlight. I guess I should have mentioned it was dark out. I wasn't allowed to use a light when doing the ritual, though. I'm not particularly sure how anyone would know if I ever did, but I decided to play by the rules anyway. The middle stall door was already closed. I went over to the sink that was facing the stall, then with a bit of a nervous chuckle, I began to say the incantation, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel. As anyone would, I made sure to pause for a moment before saying it for the final time. With a deep breath, I said the final Bloody Mabel. I stood there for half a second, expecting something really to happen. Of course, nothing did. The bit of nervousness I'd felt in the beginning went away almost instantly. I actually felt really relaxed now. As I turned and walked back into the hallway, though, I found myself face to face with the nastiest looking man I'd ever seen. Standing there in dirty clothes, staring daggers at me right in the eyes. In shock, I fell back onto the floor. The man looked like some sort of vagrant, really dirty and unshaven. He didn't seem to have a weapon on him at all, but the sheer look on his face told me he was not pleased at seeing me there. Likely he was just a homeless man living in the old building, wanting to stay undetected. Now I had discovered his hiding place, and that was not good for him. I tried to get up, but when I moved, he loomed over me. I was scared. I had no idea what the man was going to do. He grabbed me and pulled me up. He shoved me against the wall hard. I remember it was so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I did the only thing I could think to do. It was automatic. I didn't even have time to think about it. I used every ounce of strength I had and kneed him right in the crotch. He buckled over, but surprisingly, he still didn't let go of me. I continued to knee him 2 more times. The man doubled over in pain, and I hightailed it out of the old building. My friends all noticed how disheveled I looked, and I told them someone really was in there. At first, they all thought I was just trying to scare them by claiming it was Bloody Mabel, but I explained what had really happened. One of my friends went and called the police, but when the police searched the old building, they didn't find anyone else there. Me and my friends were by the busted window the whole time. And we know the guy didn't come out that way, so either he had found a different way to move in and out, or he had a really good hiding place. I mean, it must have been one of those, because I know there's no such thing as any Bloody Mabel. I went to boarding school as a child. My family is pretty well off, and they've always tried to make it seem like sending me to a boarding school was the best thing for my education. Honestly though, I thought it was the best thing for them to avoid parenting as much as possible. If I sound bitter, I'm really not for the most part. Actually, I really enjoyed boarding school. However, there was one year when I was 12 that I did not have a positive experience at all. You see, there was this guy in my grade who was a bit of a bully. You know, the type that goes to a really good school and almost makes you wonder how he even managed to get himself in this place. Now, if that part makes me sound bitter, that's because I certainly was. The kid's name was Scott, and he made my life a living hell for a short period of time. Whenever he saw me, he would push me, poke me, prod me, punch me, call me every name in the book. I really couldn't understand why he'd singled me out so much for this sort of torment, because I was definitely not the nerdish or bookish type. I guess there was just something about me he didn't like very much. Our interactions probably wouldn't have gone past normal bullying if it hadn't been for one certain incident in particular. I was walking on the grounds between classes. It had been raining, so the ground was really wet and mushy. I wasn't in that much of a hurry to get to class, but I was somewhat absent-minded, so when I suddenly tripped over something and fell face first into a large puddle of mud, I was completely covered in wet sludge. I turned over and saw Scott there. He was laughing his ass off, as if he had just seen the funniest thing in his whole life. I knew I couldn't go to class this messy. I knew I had to go back to my dorm room to change all my clothes, which of course meant I would be late for my next class and would likely get demerits for it. Pissed beyond belief, I grabbed a handful of mud and shoved it right in Scott's face. Getting up, I kicked him even harder in the crotch. He crumpled to the ground, cursing at me, threatening the hell out of me too. The problem was for him, in his current condition, he wasn't going to be able to do much. After that event, I didn't even mind the fact that I was late for class. Instead, I felt really good for finally standing up for myself. I guess it was quite short-sighted in hindsight, though. I honestly thought that all my problems with Scott would be ended that night. I returned to my dorm and the lights were all out. I saw my roommate was lying in bed, so I decided not to disturb him. I came in, undressed, and decided to get some rest myself. I climbed into bed and dozed off for a while. Later into the night, though, something awoke me very suddenly. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but it was definitely something. I looked around the room and saw my roommate was sitting up in his bed looking over at me also. I asked him if something was wrong, but he didn't respond to me. He just sat there looking at me. After a moment, he waved me off and laid back down on the bed. I certainly thought that was very weird, but I didn't think too much of it. I dozed back off. The next time I awoke, it's because I felt someone nudging me. I opened my eyes, only to see Scott standing over me. My eyes shot over to my roommate's bed, only to see it was empty. I was going to yell or scream, but Scott put his hand over my mouth and pressed really hard against it. Then he pulled out a pocket knife. Scared, I tried screaming again. I tried to bite his hand even. I tried anything to get him off me, but to no avail. Scott flipped open the blade. Then he took the knife and slowly traced it down, stopping on my boxer shorts. "You kicked me in the balls, you know. It seems only fair I get you back." I screamed in his hand some more and tried with all my might to push him off. Fortunately, though, he moved the knife away from my boxers. He brought it up to my face, though, and cut a little line down my cheek. I immediately felt the blood spilling out, and I began to cry. "Next time, it will be your balls," he said. Then he punched me in the face and warned me that if I told anyone, he would kill me and my roommate. Well, of course I told. I mean, anyone who didn't tell who had threatened them with a knife needs to have their head examined. He was picked up soon after by the campus police and got turned over to the actual police soon after. He was expelled from the school and I never saw him again. Thank God for that. I definitely dreamt of that night over and over again for years after though, and it left me with quite a scar. I remember when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, my school had a teacher's strike. It was a long one too. School was canceled every day for at least 2 weeks. When it appeared the strike was not going to end anytime soon, the school board brought in substitute teachers to teach all the classes. A lot of students were pretty pissed off that their extended summer break had finally ended. I, however, was ecstatic that I was finally getting back to class. Yeah, so I was a bit of a nerd, what of it? Well, of course, the teachers striking were pretty pissed off about the substitutes. A few of them were so immature about it, they even heckled some of the students as they were going to class. One of the teachers, we'll just call her Mrs. Lulak, took some pretty nasty things to me as I was walking by their picket line. She had sort of a reputation for being a bit of a bitch, so I did my best to just ignore her. It was really an odd way to behave towards a 3rd grader. One of the days that I was in class, another incident happened as well. Mrs. Lulak got way too close to the building I was supposed to have been in. Her classroom had the teachers not been on strike. While our substitute was out of the room, she came right up to the open window, stuck her arm in, and acted like she was trying to grab around for something. It really scared the crap out of all of us. She fled before the substitute came back as well. All in all, a strike was one thing, but this woman just came across as mentally unbalanced to me, and this is from the perspective of a 3rd grader. Extremely mentally unbalanced. Of course, there was a boundary the striking teachers were not supposed to cross, but she had no respect for not crossing it. The strike went on for the 3rd week with more of these strange incidents occurring. I told my mom about how she was behaving, and she claimed she would call the school about it. I'm not sure she ever did though. Maybe she just forgot. When I went to school on Monday morning, I noticed Miss Lulak was not in the picket line anymore. I felt a bit better about that. I even suspected that if the strike ended, she still wouldn't come back to become my teacher because of her actions during it. During the 3rd class of that day, I really had to go to the bathroom, like really badly. I couldn't wait for the normal bathroom break, so I raised my hand to see if I could go. I got permission and walked into the bathroom to one of the urinals. As I was walking to the sink though, a stall door suddenly opened behind me, and someone grabbed me from behind. They pulled me into the stall, closing the door behind us. I was startled to turn around and see that it was Miss Lulak in the boys' bathroom. She grabbed me and started to shake me back and forth. She kept on blabbering about wanting her fucking classroom back. She shook me so hard I hit my head on the wall of the stall several times. I'm sure it was then I started crying. I was completely terrified. She shoved me back against the wall, and I fell to the floor bawling. The stall door opened just then, and the custodian that was there saw what was happening. He instructed her to step back from me immediately, then put his hand out gently towards me. I grabbed it, and he pulled me to my feet and put me behind him. He let me out of the bathroom and took me to the nurse's office as well, before going to speak with the principal immediately. My parents came to the school to pick me up. My father was of course furious. He demanded that she be arrested and fired. I don't really know exactly what happened to her after that, but I do know she did not become my teacher that year, and I never saw her again after. When I was in elementary school, there was this really nice janitor that I really liked. Most of the other kids made fun of him actually, but I was never sure why they did. They told stories about him and claimed that he was mentally ill, or he had escaped from the crazy house or something. I think it was because he seemed a little bit off to them. He was quiet and never responded when any of the other students were talking to him. Sometimes he would just stare at people quite blankly as well. I was the type of kid, however, who hated to see people sad. I hated to see people getting picked on for no reason. So one day, when I saw just how sad this was making the janitor, I decided to do something nice for him to cheer him up. I went out during recess and picked a couple of daisies. I brought them into the school and gave them to him. He took them, and I actually saw the man smile for the very first time. I also heard him speak for the very first time when he said thank you to me. After that, for a couple of weeks, the janitor seemed a lot different than before. He smiled whenever he saw me, and he would always say, "Hi, Jenny." I would always say hi right back to him. Some of the other kids made fun of me for talking to him and joked that the janitor must have a crush on me. I just ignored them. People saying mean things never really bothered me at all. A few weeks after, I had the first talk with the janitor personally. I brought him more flowers from the schoolyard. This time, when I handed them to him and he thanked me, he said something else. "Hey, do you want to see where I keep all the daisies you bring me?" As he asked me this, I of course nodded and told him yes. I was pretty interested. He then told me to follow him. He led me down to the janitor's closet, which was a bit down the hall. He opened the door and turned on the light. I had given him quite a lot of flowers over the past 5 or 6 weeks. It seemed like every single one of them was in there. Somehow, he also had my school picture as well. Who knows how he got it in the first place? It was hanging up on the wall by the vase that was overstuffed with dying flowers. For the first time, I was actually a bit concerned about this guy. Before I could even say anything to him, though, the janitor grabbed me and pushed me back into the room. I fell down on my knees. He flicked the light off and for some reason closed the door behind him. I heard it lock from the outside, and I began to panic like any 10-year-old girl would in such a situation. I began screaming and crying at the top of my lungs. I ran over to the door and began pounding on it with my tiny fists and kicking it with my feet. Tears began to flow down my face. The only fortunate thing about the situation was that I was too young to have any idea what he really wanted from me in that moment. It was likely that I was only in that closed closet for a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. Eventually, I heard the key in the door, and the door was opened. Outside was the school principal and the gym teacher. Apparently, a few kids had seen him shove me into the closet and ran to get the principal right away. The principal took me by the hand and told me that he would take me to the nurse's office to call my parents. The gym teacher had the janitor by the collar and was told to take him to the principal's office and call the police right away. I was okay in the end. My mom and dad were so pissed though. They demanded the man be fired right away and put in jail. Obviously, he was fired, and I never saw him again after. I have no idea if he went to jail though. To this day, my parents won't tell me anything else about the incident, likely to protect me. This took place in February of 1988, when I was just 8 years old. I'm now approaching my mid-40s. I still have massive anxiety whenever I think back to that night. For context, I'm a man, and have always been the shortest person in my class, with the smallest body frame. I was living with my mom, my stepdad, and my older sister who was 3 years my senior. Because my parents were extremely poor, we found ourselves moving around quite a bit. At the time this story took place, we were renting out a rundown duplex in Utah. I'm fairly confident this took place on a Wednesday evening, as that was the weekday my family would gather around the television and watch America's Most Wanted. After the TV show had ended around 9 p.m., we said goodnight and headed off to our own bedrooms. It was a school night, so I often went to bed around 9 or so. Our duplex had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the main floor and 1 in the basement. My room was on the main floor, just down the hall from the living room, while my mom and stepdad's bedroom was adjacent to mine at the end of the hallway. My older sister had the lone room in the basement. At that age, I was fearful of the dark, so I often slept with my bedroom light on to allow perfect vision. Because my parents never paid their bills anyway, they never had an issue with this, as most other parents might. We had a false sense of security living in this small Utah town, so my parents never locked our front door. My mom and her husband always had a lock on their bedroom door though, and made sure to lock it every night so we kids couldn't come in unexpectedly. I remember drifting off to sleep shortly after laying down. It must have been around 1 a.m. or so, when I was abruptly awoken by a peculiar noise coming from my room. As I sat up in my bed in response to the noise, I was horrified to see 2 grown men sporting biker beards and easily towering 6 feet tall, standing in my bedroom doorway. Again, I was able to see every detail of these slovenly men because my light had been left on. The men standing in the doorway were blocking me in my room so I could not move past them. They both had the most evil glare in their eyes that I had ever seen too. I was petrified with fear. I don't know why I did this, but in that moment of complete shock, I jumped up from my bed and onto my feet. Only then did it dawn on me that my tiny body was not going to be able to do anything to these guys. My parents' room was directly against their backs. My first instinct was to run to them and call out. Looking back now though, I realize it would have done no good because of how securely they slept, comfortably behind their locked bedroom door while this was taking place. Once my body's motions caught up to my thought process, I instead ran to the corner of my room and crouched down. All the while, the 3 of us were just staring at each other. I tried to let out a scream or call for my parents, but this was the only time in my life where I couldn't even make a noise. My vain attempts to scream mounted into silent desperation. I didn't know what these people wanted, and I could only imagine the worst. One of the men pushed his index finger to his lips to signal me to remain quiet. As I trembled with fear, the second man reached into his pocket and pulled out a 6-inch blade. My room was fairly small, and they were both now standing within 4 feet of me. He made sure to swivel the knife in the air to make the point he was not afraid to gut me like a fish. I swear I pissed in my pajamas. Another attempt to scream yielded nothing yet again. Shortly after, they closed my bedroom door, and I was left all alone. Instinctively, I thought they must be robbing our house, but now that they were exposed and had threatened me, they would now leave. But boy, was I wrong. I waited a few minutes, not knowing what to do. Do I open the door and try to pound on my parents' door? Were the guys still waiting for me there behind the now closed door? Who knew? After a few minutes, I gathered what little courage I could and decided to crawl back in my bed and place the sheet over my entire body and wait it out. Were they planning on killing my family? I asked myself. Did they leave yet? What did they want? My anxiety grew as thoughts continued to race through my mind. As I lay there intently listening for any sounds, I could hear them moving around the house and opening and closing various drawers. The walls were paper thin in that cheap duplex, so every move was easily heard. Next, I heard them make their way down the stairs to the basement where my sister was sleeping alone. I was listening to every frightening sound, with all hope in my heart that my stepdad would wake up. He was a fairly large and intimidating man, and these creeps weren't exactly being super quiet. This went on for nearly an hour. I was lying petrified in bed listening to every move. To my horror, my entire family seemed to be sleeping through the ordeal. After some time, I heard the front door shut once again, and the early winter sun began rising. My stepdad worked in a factory and usually woke up around 5 a.m. I couldn't wait to hear my parents unlock their bedroom door. As soon as I heard their alarm, I ran out of my room. I was hysterical, trying to explain what had happened. Next, my sister woke up. I desperately wanted to tell her what happened by herself in the basement. My parents tried their best to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face, and I had been traumatized. To my disbelief, though, my parents chalked it up to being only a bad dream. In fact, I was told this was not even possible, because if anything like that ever happened, surely they would wake up. My sister saw the desperation in my eyes and knew this must be serious. She and I went through the entire house to look for items that might have been stolen. We came across her dresser drawers left half open and many personal items out of place. This was enough evidence for her to become just as frightened as I was. Because nothing was missing from our house, though, my parents didn't even bother calling the police. I was made to go to school as if nothing had ever happened. Fast forward a couple of weeks, though, we were all watching TV together, and an update came on about a criminal being captured, featured on Most Wanted. My heart immediately sank when I recognized the mugshot on TV as being one of the men who was in my room that night. Of course, disclosing this to my parents only made them believe me even less. To this day, I still hold some resentment towards them. While they slept peacefully behind a locked bedroom door, I was busy being victimized. Needless to say, I never sleep without locking my door from then on. I can't say I necessarily enjoyed going out and exploring the countryside, but it is something that I did a whole lot when I was younger. I think mostly because living out in the country, there wasn't exactly a whole lot else to do. My family never had cable back then, because this happened so long ago and it wasn't available in such a rural area. Other than that, we also lived far enough away from any of my friends or relatives that we couldn't spend time with them often and do things together. So, a lot of my free time, especially in the summer, was spent exploring the countryside on my lonesome. I didn't know a lot about the history of the area that we lived in, and this was before it was easy to just look these things up on the internet. Because of this, I never knew if I would find anything interesting or noteworthy out there. I always thought it would be cool to come across an Indian arrowhead or something like that. Like pretty much every kid in the world who goes out exploring in the country, I always hoped I would find something valuable out there one day. I mean, who knew if there was a gold piece stuck out there somewhere or something? Anyway, this one day in this one summer, I was really bored and went off exploring as usual. This time, though, I tried heading off in a direction I hadn't really ever gone in before. I had avoided it mostly because my dad told me to. It was private property, I guess, and the man who owned it got very angry if he caught anyone out there. Plus, he claimed there were abandoned mines out there, and if I accidentally fell into one of those, it might be the last time anyone ever saw me alive. I went off in that direction, only slightly worried that one of these fates might befall me. I guess the slight fear made the hike a little bit more interesting. Other than that, though, it was kind of fun thinking about the possibility of getting caught, too. I don't know how long I had been out there, nor how many hills I had crossed over already. Eventually, though, being on one side of a particular hill, I looked over at the one opposite facing it. I saw that inlaid about 3/4 of the way up the hill was what looked like either a cave or some sort of mine driven into the side. I assumed because of where it was most likely just a cave. It didn't look like it would be that easy to climb to, but it seemed very interesting to me, so I decided to go check it out. Getting to the opening was not easy. The hill was a whole lot steeper than the other ones I had experience with. After quite a bit of effort, including grasping onto trees that had thorns and caused my hands to bleed a little, I was finally able to make it up that steep hill and to the opening of this cave. I was actually a little bit apprehensive right away. This was the first such cave I had ever come across, despite all of the time I'd spent out there exploring. It was, as you might imagine, very, very dark, and I had only brought a small flashlight with me. I hadn't expected to come across a cave or be out after dark, so it was only one of those pen flashlights I always had with me in my backpack. It was a little damp inside, but that didn't really bother me so much. It was easy enough to avoid stepping into the water. Mostly, I was worried about the possibility of disturbing any bats that were in there. We didn't have as good an understanding about them back then as we do nowadays, so we thought that all bats bit, and they all carried rabies as well. It was bright enough at the opening, As I made my way into the cave though, I took out my pen light just in case I would need it. Of course, the very first thing I did was look at the ceiling to see if there were any bats inside. Fortunately, at least in concern of my feelings, I was happy not to see any in there. I probably would have screamed and started running had I seen even one of them. As I kept walking further into the cave, the light I got from the outside was now nearly gone. Soon, it was gone altogether. I suppose I should have headed back when it got to that point, but I was way too captured by curiosity with all of this. Although the entrance seemed to be a normal natural cave, further in it had wooden beams inside that looked like they had been made to reinforce the structure. Perhaps people had mined in this cave before. I mean, I didn't know enough about the differences between caves and mines to really know. The weirdest part, though, at this point were the echoes. My footfalls would sound like the footfalls of other people. A couple of times I even jumped, thinking that I heard someone following behind me. I was able to calm myself down after each try, though, when suddenly I noticed something up ahead. It looked like something was lying on the ground up against the wall of the cave. It was too hard to make out in the dark at first, being that I only had this small light on me. However, as I got closer, I noticed something that stuck with me to this very day. There were bones in that cave. Although it was not a complete skeleton, I was able to tell there was a human skull there. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that before, and it truly scared me. I knew though that these bones had been there for a very long time, and whatever had killed this person couldn't possibly still be there to be a danger to me. But then I heard it. It sounded like someone whispering further down the cave. I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly at first, but when I froze and did my best to listen, I began to make it out clearer. There was absolutely someone whispering deeper in the darkness of that cave, echoing all the way up to me. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it was definitely a human voice. That was even scarier to me than finding that skull there. I got up and tried my best to hurry up out of the cave. I heard the whispering following behind me as I made my way back to the entrance. While I wasn't scared before going into the cave with the meager light, I was scared to death coming back out of it. I didn't want to run and make too much noise. If that person deeper in the cave was following me, I didn't want them to know exactly where I was. After I made it out, I ran down that hill fast as I could. I was very lucky not to fall down that steep slope and hurt myself. I don't know who could have been making those whispering sounds, but I never went back to find out. I had this really weird thing happen a few decades ago during the summer. Around that time, we lived in this beautiful house out in the country. My older brother and my stepmom's younger brother, who was about my age, would take turns hanging out at each other's houses. I personally didn't like hanging at her brother's house much because it was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I wasn't really a big fan of that town. On the weekends, though, he would come over to our place, and we almost always went on a hike in the surrounding area. There was a ton of countryside we loved to explore. My brother and Pete, my stepmother's brother, were always out doing things together. And I mean really, really stupid things. Here are just a couple of examples. Once my brother wondered what it would feel like to piss on an electric fence, so he went and did it. Also, once at the top of the hill, there was a circular roll of hay. They decided to unravel it and roll it down the hill. Well, after they did that, every single cow that was grazing went running for that hay. We once came across a huge bulldozer sitting at the top of a hill too. They wanted to climb in the cab and mess with the gears, but fortunately I was able to talk them out of that one. One of the dumbest things I can recall them doing was taking a rock and throwing it at a bull's balls. Fortunately, when I found out they were trying to do something so moronic, I made my way up a tree before it happened. Even more fortunately for them, they were able to get up as well before being gored to death. So every time we went out on our little hikes together, I kept expecting these two guys to do something exceptionally stupid. Honestly though, the most memorable hike we ever didn't involve those two doing something stupid at all though. We'd had some frozen pizzas and watched some videos the night before, so we were really looking for something different to do on this day. We went out together. Now mind you, we lived really way out in the country. I mean, it took nearly an hour and a half to drive to the nearest town from where we were. The houses were obviously very far apart from each other as well. In fact, on the hill that we lived on, we were the first house up there. If you went further down the roads, it was nearly a 30-minute drive to the next house. We didn't know anybody in the area because of this. Plus, every single time we went out for an adventure, we never came across other people. We never came across any other hikers, we never stumbled across other houses. There were plenty of electric and barbed wire fences and animals, but no people to speak of whatsoever. On this particular day, we ended up spending a lot of time outside. I'd brought along a thermos of the worst flavored Kool-Aid, lemon lime. Whenever I tell this story, I can still taste that crap in my mind. We had been out for a really long time, walking across a few streams, climbing up and down hills. What was strange about this day, though, was that we were out a lot longer than we usually would be. Even when we ran out of stuff to drink, we just started drinking water from streams and creeks. As I was bending down to get a sip of water from a creek next to me, Pete came running up behind my brother and I. "Hey guys, you gotta see this, you won't believe this!" He was speaking in very whispered, excited tones. "Just don't make too much noise, okay? This is the freakiest thing I've ever seen." My brother and I followed close behind. He kept insisting we try not to make too much noise as we were walking. It was difficult because the ground was littered with dried and decaying leaves. He led us and crouched over to an area overlooking a creek, and that's when I saw the weirdest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Of course, keep in mind I was only 13 at that time. There was a huge man walking by the creek. I mean, he must have been the biggest man I'd ever seen. He was completely naked and covered in matted hair, which practically made up for not having clothes on. Even scarier, he was dragging a corpse behind him slowly. We couldn't tell if it was human or anything. It was skinned and he was dragging it along, which seemed quite weird to us. We all watched as he slowly walked back up the creek. I was trying not to make any noise because I was scared of this terrifying naked behemoth. I didn't want him to turn around and find us. If he did, I had no idea how he would react. That's why I was so tense. Remember how I told you earlier that Pete and my brother like to do really stupid things when we went out? I just had every feeling they were going to do something to provoke this man's attention. I just remained as still as possible, ready to run faster than both of them if they did something dumb. Surprisingly enough to me, they were too scared to do so. The man kept dragging his corpse and eventually stumbled out of view. The whole thing was so bizarre, but what really got to me was this. Pete and my brother were willing to smack a bull in the balls with a rock, but they weren't willing to do anything to get this man's attention. That means they were more scared of what we saw that day than they were of a raging animal. Just let that sink in. Just to preface, I'm not going to include any actual details about myself, as I'm in pure fear that somehow this person will track this back to me. I, 24 and male, live in a quiet neighborhood in a suburban town in Queensland, Australia, with my roommate who's a 25-year-old woman. We're childhood friends and are both finishing our studies at university. These occurrences I'm about to tell you about started around 2 months ago, with the most recent update occurring only last weekend. About 2 months ago, I can't recall the exact date, I was lying in bed late at night, watching a soccer game and drifting in and out of sleep. I usually just use this as background noise to help me get to sleep easier, as I would say I'm a very nocturnal person by nature. I was just on the edge of being awake and asleep at once when I heard an urgent pounding at my front door. With the way the house was shaped, my bedroom was approximately 10 meters away from the front door and backed onto the front courtyard. The knock startled me at first. I was unsure if it was just in my head in a dream or actually happening. I laid still in silence to see if I would hear anything further. I knew it couldn't be my roommate, as she was out of town for the week visiting family and attending a wedding. After a bit of waiting, there was a second knock, just as hard. No one called out or said anything though. I'd like to say I'm not easily scared and enjoy watching horror movies in my free time, but suddenly I found myself frozen in place, not able to move at all. No further knocks came after, but I was too frightened now to fall back asleep and didn't end up resting until around 4 a.m. or so. I called my roommate the next morning, asking if she knew anyone that would have come to our door that late in the night. But she was just as confused as I was. A week passed by and I didn't really give it too much thought anymore. I sort of came to the conclusion that maybe it was some drunk person that had mistaken our house for theirs. It was a Saturday night when this happened. I work in a large chain grocery store doing night stacking a few days a week, with my shifts ending between 2 to 4 a.m. usually. It was the next Saturday, and I was approaching the end of my shift when my roommate texted me, saying someone was knocking on the front door again. Even though I wasn't actually there, I was struck with that same kind of fear I had experienced just the week prior. She reassured me the doors were all locked, but was scared knowing the same thing had happened to me as well. She kept in touch with me until my shift was over, and told me that this time there was no second knock. When I arrived home, the front yard was untouched, and there was no one out walking the street either. I must reinstate that this is a very quiet neighborhood, with mostly elderly couples living on our street. In the morning, my roommate still seemed a bit shaken up, so I put in an anonymous tip with a Crime Stopper service. They never got back to me though. Nothing else seemed to happen for the following month and a half. We were both moving on with our lives like it never even happened. I stopped working Saturday night shifts though, as this was the only similarity between the two occurrences. That was until the most recent Saturday. I was up late in the living room, watching some old Black Mirror episodes as the new season was about to come out. It was about 1 a.m. or so, and I had plans to go to bed after that episode I was watching. For context, the room I was in was right next to the front door this time, with the path to the door going past a large window. As I was watching, I saw the outside motion sensor light turn on from the bottom of the windowsill, under the blinds. I froze up. Until this point, I had completely forgotten about that knocking, and I was struck with fear. A short moment later, an urgent knocking began. At first, I was going to sit there and wait for them to go away, but after a second loud knock, I decided to look through the peephole quietly and see if it was someone familiar. My roommate had had a few failed relationships that did not end on good terms, so I assumed maybe it was one of them trying to mess with her. But as I looked closer, it was not. It was a woman I had never seen before. She was just staring at the door, stood still like a statue. It was like she was frozen solid. Her eyes were staring straight ahead with no expression. It was like she could see me through the eye hole, just staring into my soul. She stood there for another 2 minutes or so until she looked to the side and ran off into the darkness. I called the cops and explained on the phone what had happened, and they sent someone shortly thereafter. They checked all the cars parked on the street, but came up empty-handed. They just told me to call back if anything happened again. The thing that I couldn't get out of my head, though, was the way she just stood there emotionless, staring straight ahead as if she wasn't thinking at all, and the strange way she ran off as well. She looked to be in her 30s or so, wearing a small night dress and no shoes. Not exactly someone I'd ever seen in the neighborhood before. Not only was this out of the ordinary, but it was completely freezing outside as well. Since then, I've ordered one of those doorbell cameras, just in case she does come back. To be completely honest with you though, I flinch whenever someone knocks on that door now. This happened when I was in my teens. I can't remember exactly when, but I think I was around 17 or so at this point. It was the school holidays, and I was at home with my friend, who we'll call Talia, and my domestic worker, who we'll call Lasego. It was around 11 a.m. or so, and we were just hanging out in my room together. Lasego had been washing dishes when she glanced out of the window. In another window, she saw the reflections of two men in our backyard. She ran upstairs to tell me what she had seen, and I immediately hit the panic button. The alarm started sounding loudly throughout the house. I remember calling my dad to tell him what was happening, but he was working quite far away and would take some time to get there. I believe he called the police at that point. I wanted to run downstairs and lock the security gate at the bottom, but at that point, over the loud wailing of the alarm system, I could distinctly hear the crack of wood splintering as they broke in the back door of the house. I was worried they would be faster than me and decided not to go downstairs to lock the gate. Instead, we raced across the upstairs landing to lock ourselves in my parents' bedroom. We reached the bedroom door, and fuck, there was no key. We ran back across the landing again. Just as we were passing the top of the stairs, we saw those two men bounding up them just a meter away. They were both extremely large, clutching in their hands a screwdriver and a rope. Not a good sign. Lasego tried to grab our cell phones from the guest room as we passed. One of the men slapped her across the face, grabbed the phones, and pushed her into the room. Talia and I kept running, with the two men just a couple of meters behind us. We reached the end of the landing, dashed into my mom's office, and slammed the door hard behind me. My heart sank as I heard the clink of the key hitting the opposite wall. It had been on the other side of the door. At this point, Talia was hysterical, crying in the corner with both hands on her head as I held the door shut. What are we gonna do? I felt strangely calm, though. I just remember thinking I could not let anything happen to either of my friends. There was a knock on the door behind me. Hello? I was in utter disbelief as these two intruders calmly knocked on the office door as if what was happening was the most normal thing in the entire world. We didn't respond. They knocked again. Hello? Once again, we didn't respond. The two men started turning the doorknob and pushing the door open against my back. I tried to stop the knob from turning, but I couldn't get a good grip on it. I pushed back against them, digging my heels into the carpet as deep as possible. Just then, the phone started to ring. I knew it must be someone calling to help us. I shouted to Talia to answer the phone and tell them what was happening, and to speak loudly as well. I wanted the intruders to know someone was on their way. While she was on the phone with the security company, I was fighting with these two men with all my strength for control over this single door. They pushed it open wide enough for a small adult to slip through, and I shoved back with all my might to get it just about shut again. This struggle went on for what felt like forever, but in reality was probably only a few minutes. The whole time the alarm was blaring loudly. Eventually, the men gave up, and after waiting it out for a while, we felt safe enough to leave the room. My dad got there first, and we told them everything that happened. An armed response team arrived 40 minutes after we spoke to them on the phone. Yeah, geez, we'd already be dead or worse at that point. The police arrived 2 hours after them. Yeah, no one relies on the cops in South Africa. It was only when we were explaining the whole thing to the cops that the reality really started to set in and the adrenaline started to wear off. I went into shock and was all shaky for a bit. I felt grateful that everyone was okay in the end. I'm still amazed by what adrenaline can accomplish. How did my tiny teenage girl self hold back these two huge fully grown men? Completely insane. After that day, I realized just what I'm capable of when shit hits the fan, and also that if shit goes down, you're really on your own sometimes, and you need to have a plan, because chances are no one is getting there in time to actually help you. My boyfriend showed me this sub a while back, and after lurking for a hot second, I realized I had my own story to tell. The summer of my junior year in high school, I'd been romantically involved with a guy. We'd gotten to the point in our relationship where he was ready for me to meet his friends. We decided it would be cool if we all went to the state fair that was in town for the next few days. With a little bit of planning and corralling, we all hopped into my boyfriend's little Taurus and headed for the city. Keep in mind, we're all a bunch of dumb, edgy teenagers, so a pre-game hotbox was a must for any event. With the exception of my boyfriend who was driving, we were all pretty damn high. At one point, one of the girls in the car suggested we pull over and get some snacks from the gas station coming up. For whatever reason, I was the one who managed to get stuck with the job of running in and grabbing what everyone wanted. I was annoyed, but pretty desperate for his friends to think I was cool. I jotted down everyone's requests on my phone and headed inside. I walked up and down a few aisles for a bit, trying to find what I could from the list. Around the end of my little shopping spree, I picked up a bag of chocolate-dipped pretzels and turned to head to checkout. That was when an older man in the row behind me called out and asked me to toss him a bag. I, of course, thought nothing of this and figured I'd save him the trip and be nice. I threw one over to him. I took my snacks to the counter, and that was when I noticed the man was now following me. He asked me a few questions, like my name and where I was headed with all that food. I don't know if it was because I was blitzed or just stupid, but I happily answered all his questions, even telling him my real name, and that I was headed to the fair with some friends. He smiled and told me my name was the same as his daughter's name. He seemed polite enough, maybe a bit too chatty and bad with social cues, but otherwise harmless. It was then that he offered to pay for my things, telling me I should save my money for the fair. I shook my head and insisted it was fine, but thanked him for the offer. He slapped his hand hard on my shoulder. It lingered for a bit too long. He whispered and told me not to move, and he'd get his wallet from his truck. I started to feel a bit uneasy then. I exchanged glances with the woman at the counter, and I could tell the weird feeling was mutual. I tried to use him going to his car as a chance to fish out my money, pay for my shit, and get the fuck out of there. I grabbed my receipt and started sprinting towards the car when the man made a beeline right for me in the parking lot. He wagged his finger and scolded me for leaving without waiting. I uncomfortably laughed it off and told him I should be getting back to my friends. They'd been waiting for a long time. It was then that he steered the conversation away from the snacks and asked me if I wanted to see some pictures of his daughter. He told me he kept them in his glove box, and if I wanted to see them, it would only take a second. Finally, alarms were going off in my stupid head. I declined him and told him I really needed to go right now. He reached a hand out and grabbed me by the arm towards him, repeating over and over again that it would only be a couple of minutes. I panicked and started screaming, trying to yank my arm away. That was just enough of a reaction to start turning heads in the parking lot. The man let go of me and rushed back to his car. Hyperventilating and clutching my bag of snacks, I sprinted to the Taurus, where I was bombarded with questions from my boyfriend and his friends. Apparently, everyone had thought I knew the man, up until I started screaming. They intended to come out and help once they realized what was going on, but the interaction had just ended that fast that they were unable to do anything. For a few hours, I considered reporting the incident to someone, but I figured I didn't have enough info or reasoning to justify it. I still can't help but think what would have happened in that parking lot, had it been a little emptier, or if I'd come alone. This story begins about 5 years ago, when I was a junior in high school. There was a boy in my grade, Jack, who didn't have a lot of friends. He's on the lower end of the autism spectrum, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome. That affected his ability to pick up on social cues in his interactions with peers. Although I always knew him to be a bit awkward, he was nice enough, and I felt badly that he spent so much time alone. Eating lunch alone, sitting alone at all the school activities. When he joined theater junior year, an activity I'd been a part of since I was 6, I decided to help in bringing him into the fold. Although more creative clubs do have reputations for being more accepting, it's still a difficult thing to join halfway through when everyone is already close-knit friends with everyone else. I would make my best effort to include Jack in conversations with the groups at rehearsals, talk to him one-on-one, invite him to sit with us at lunch. I even gave him my phone number to chat about things once in a while. When he asked me to hang out with him after a month or so of friendship, I said yes. I came to his family's barn and had a very nice time visiting with all the animals and eating dinner with his family. They said a few heartbreaking things throughout the dinner, like it was so nice to see him finally having a friend. They said they liked me much better than the one other friend he had, who I knew to be a kid who also had some disabilities. Unfortunately, this is around the time when our interactions stopped being healthy. He developed a severe attachment to me. It became very clear to me that he saw me in a romantic way, which I didn't return the feelings. Now that wouldn't have been too problematic if he hadn't started to pursue me in such an obsessive manner. He began texting me every hour of the day. If I ever didn't reply, I would receive another text emphasizing his last, or he would copy and paste the same message over and over again. If it were simply him saying hello to start a conversation, he would post it again and again and again until I finally responded. This was not always me ignoring him, mind you. Sometimes I was at work and unable to respond. Then, when I would unlock my phone, I'd have 10 messages from him like this. Additionally, if I did talk to him, he began pouring out every deep thought to me about depression and even having considered suicide in the past. While I'm a compassionate person who will do anything to help others, this worried me for multiple reasons. One, I'm not a trained therapist, and while I can offer some support, I don't always know the right thing to say to help. The last thing I want to do is say the wrong thing and trigger someone into hurting themselves. Additionally, I feared that him sharing these vulnerable thoughts with me and having me comfort him would make him feel as though the bond between us was closer than it was and cause him to latch on even tighter. I tried my best and advised him to speak to our school guidance counselor, which he declined as he claimed that only I could ever understand him. Around this time, he began following me to work. I didn't have a license at the time, so I had to walk from school to my after-school shifts. The store was less than a mile away, so it didn't really bother me. Jack would find me at my locker and start talking to me on my walk to the front door of the school building. I would say, "Bye, I have to go to work," but instead of waiting for his ride, he would follow behind me through the parking lot, down the street, and the entire way to where I worked. As the store I worked at is one where the customers come up to the counter and can't come inside, he would just lurk around in the parking lot for 20 minutes to half an hour, never buying anything, before eventually turning around and walking back to the school. My manager and I were both very disturbed by this whenever it happened, and I would hide in the back or clean until he left. Then the performance of our musical came, and the creep factor amped up even more. He was still constantly texting me, of course, but at this point I was going through a lot of mental health issues of my own. I didn't really have the patience to deal with this constant bothering. I replied every few days or so, but I wouldn't engage in more than casual conversation. He began to incessantly comment on everything I posted, Instagram, Facebook, responding to every single tweet. In person, he also followed me around constantly. More than once, he'd attempted to barge into the girls' dressing room and made several comments about my body and specifically my breasts to my face during that week. He happened to leave his phone on a table by me, and when I went to return it, I saw his lock screen was a photo that said, "Boobs are like the sun. If you wear sunglasses, you can stare at them as long as you like." As soon as the musical was over, I didn't have to see him on a regular basis and decided to block him on everything. His constant replies were really starting to freak me out. I told him multiple times that I couldn't always be there to talk to him, but he never listened. I blocked his number. Summer was actually quiet. I enjoyed the fact I didn't have to see or hear from him for a long time. Unfortunately, the school year brought back some contact with him, as he was now a recurring member of theater. He tried to confront me about blocking him in front of a large group of people. I just said we could talk about it later, and he failed to bring it back up. 2 weeks later, though, I got a Twitter notification that my phone contact Jack had joined Twitter as a user posing as the school debate team. I also had a notification saying he'd followed me. He made a fake account for a club that didn't even exist at school just in order to follow me. To my advantage, he'd used his real phone number or email when making that account. Therefore, I was able to quickly block him and told my close friends to do the same. For most part, my senior year went mostly quiet, except for an incident where he'd parked right next to me and tried to hit my car. I'm somewhat sure it was just because he's a really bad driver, but I've always had a tinge of doubt in my mind. I wish I could say the story ended there, that his crush just faded out with high school graduation, and the blocks on his account and number gave him enough closure to move on. Fast forward to fall of 2017. It's been about 2.5 years since I graduated from high school. I was going through my account on Twitter and adjusting some things, and saw I still had some people set to notifications that I didn't really talk to anymore. Some people I'd blocked from old grudges that I'd long since gotten over. I saw Jack was still blocked, and figured that everything had occurred so long ago that he must be over it by now. I decided to unblock him, assuming the chances would be rare he would comment or do anything. Likes are innocent enough. How wrong I was. In my defense, it did take him quite a while to notice. Whether I just didn't pop up on his timeline for some time, or he just didn't use those applications for a while, I didn't hear from him until spring of 2018, 3 years after we'd left high school. He commented on something I posted, trying to start an argument. When I responded, he said he could never win an argument against me. Seemed innocent enough. I liked his comment and moved on. The next day, I got a message from him. "I see you're still the same as you were in high school." I responded for a bit and then stopped replying. It was only small talk, but I didn't want to contact him any further. I had a sinking feeling he was falling back in his old pattern. The next day, I got another message. Hey, are you there? I need to tell you something really important." I was taking a nap at the time, so I couldn't respond. 10 minutes later, according to the timestamp, he DM'd me the same message on Instagram and Twitter. Another 5 minutes later, I get the same message as a text, even though I didn't have his number. At this point, all the notifications woke me up. I was annoyed and felt I knew what he was going to say. "I had a huge crush on you in high school, and I still do now." At this point, I was enraged. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, or interacted with him at all during that time. He made my favorite activity stressful and uncomfortable for me. He followed me to work several times. He knows nothing about the person I'd developed into in the years since I graduated. I decided to do what I hadn't done at that point, which was explicitly tell him about how inappropriate everything he'd done was. I knew he had a disability that made it hard for him to tell how people felt about things he said or did, and that's why I felt I needed to be brutally honest. I decided clearly he had some kind of fixation on me that seemed to transcend the boundaries of distance, time, or sight, so I blocked and deleted him on everything since. I recently received a friend request that reminded me of this story. This happened after I went to university, so I was about 18 years old at the time. I had made an effort to make friends after I moved onto campus, and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards to eat in pairs or threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd go with, because I got along fine with most people from the class, and we were all sort of trying to make an effort to be social at that age. This meant that when one particular girl, Lily, asked if I wanted to go eat lunch together after that class, I didn't have any reason to refuse. We talked about school and mostly pretty casual stuff. Nothing really noteworthy. She did ask me to get lunch with her again the next week, though. Soon it became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine with me, but it did mean I lost the chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days, which sort of hindered my social life a little. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point, though. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media, and this just happened to occur in front of Lily. Immediately, I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore. I still remember it even to this day. Needless to say, by the time I'd gotten home later, Lily had already sent me a friend request. We had no friends in common either. I don't even know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess maybe she dug through the university's social media pages and found me through there or something. I did get a bad feeling, but surely this was fine. She ended up messaging me quite a lot and commenting on anything I posted. I told myself she was just awkward. We became friends, if not close, and I'd known worse people. She still always got me to go eat lunch with her after our shared class. Other than that, though, we very rarely had any time together in person. I would see her around sometimes, but I never went out of my way to hang out with her, you know? This meant it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also called Lily. This was something that clearly bothered the other Lily. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name, or joked about it not suiting her. Clearly, she did not like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea as to why. It was getting hard to ignore by this point. Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried my best not to address it. I mean, what was I gonna say? I'd never known what to do when a friend tried to make a pass at me. I was also not interested in the very least. Even ignoring some of the weird stuff she did, Lily was just not my type. She tended to act and dress in a way somewhere between a 50s housewife and all those adults still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can picture that combination. Things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she usually did, she asked if I'd go out for a walk with her. Again, I didn't know how to refuse, so I said a small one would be fine. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me out into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log and I joined her. She started talking about how much she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried placating her, but I really didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed to be on the verge of tears. I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could say anything, Lily chose to lean in and kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think I would not see her for a while. I came back to university after summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic, there were some serious issues in that group. Lots of petty arguing, and even worse, I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of that school year as well. Basically, the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Lily. It didn't seem quite so bad after all that drama. That said, I still didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly just talked online. She was still constantly messaging me every day after all. One upside of everything was that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to kinda sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that was never going to happen. This is where the story gets bad. At this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life and mostly just reblogged photos and things I found interesting. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed had received an ask with some phrases I recognized. It took a second to register that it was taken from my About page. That made me freeze. I read the message properly. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking for their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress how messed up it was to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book or something. The important thing, though, was that the question had not been anonymous. It linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me in particular. As far as I knew, not a single person in real life knew about my page. It's not like I shared it around or anything. No prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I found was disturbing. It was almost like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interest, but most of the content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were all about me. There were accounts of things I'd done recently, places I'd been, groups I participated in, going to the nightclub recently, as well as references to things as far back as I'd known her. It was clear she'd been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering every scrap of information she could about my life and hoarding it in this little collection. She talked about us eating lunch together, how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintances just getting food after class. She even talked about the time she had forcibly kissed me in the woods. She quoted lyrics from all of my favorite songs, even though I'd never talked about them, and talked about how she'd always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just the way he is as well, which answered another mystery about some anonymous love letters I'd been receiving earlier that year with the same wording. It got worse. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. Those were not so nice. It was angry and hateful. I didn't like to think of the sort of person who could write so obsessively being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first was that the blog had also made plenty of references to this best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me, and I'd never seen anyone else around her either. Her post talked a lot about Steven and how great a friend he was, how much fun they had together, how much he looked out for her. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend or something, when one specific post made it all click. She had posted a photo and captioned it, "Steven sent this to me. He knew I would like it." The problem was, it was a photo taken straight from my page. I had not sent that to her. She took it from my page and then claimed I was her fictional best friend, because in her head she'd split me into two people, the two most important people in her life. In her messed up fantasies, I was both her perfect best friend and her soulmate who was going to end up with her. Who was she complaining to? Oh, she had an audience, all right. People who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with this stalker, things like my boyfriend didn't deserve me, we were bound to break up soon, I would be with Lily, the person I was clearly destined to be with. She had this fake fanfiction version of my life up for anyone to share their opinion on, and she made herself out to be the hero of it all, of course. I had only gone maybe a month back into this page's history, and I didn't look at everything that was there. It was too much, and I didn't want to see if there was anything from before I'd known her. Needless to say, I sent Lily a message confronting her about this blog. She said nothing. I can't stress how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me. Then she just acted like it never happened. She said nothing. Didn't even address it, just changed the subject like I'd never even said it, like she hadn't even registered that it existed. I've never seen deflection quite like it. Well, of course, afterward she deleted the page, or at least changed the name and hid it, because I could never find it again. That was not the end, though. I was not going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still shoved together in classes. She had started to actually scare me with what she might do next. I'm kind of a paranoid person already, so knowing someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long really scared me a lot. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. That was a useless attempt. What was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me he cheated and wait for me to break up with him or something? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work, she tried to seduce all of my friends. None of them took the bait, thankfully. She ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but made sure to send me messages every day while they were together, letting me know she'd rather be with me instead. Lily made sure to stay in my life the entire time I was at university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting these malicious rumors about me and damaging a career opportunity I'd put a lot of time into. I don't know all of what she did behind my back, but it made me realize it might be safer to just let her think she was a part of my life while ignoring her, rather than do something that would cause her to get angry. I knew at this point she really didn't have any reservations about hurting me to get what she wanted. After I graduated, Lily of course still wanted to hang around me. But now, I didn't have that additional impetus of school keeping me there. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I had entirely stopped posting on social media I knew she knew about. Of course, she would not give up that easily. Usually, I ignored all of her attempts though. I didn't think she was still tracking me online, but in hindsight, she probably was. I don't know how, but she'd reference things I mentioned online somewhere else she couldn't have known about. The last time we had a conversation for real, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in much longer than that. Thinking about that conversation still makes my skin crawl. At first, she asked me some questions about how long I'd known I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of things I'd tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how I would feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy for me. The messages quickly became fetishistic. Again, we were not even friends at this point. We'd never been especially close, and we'd barely spoken for years. I can't imagine sending messages like that even to a close friend, let alone someone who barely knew you. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, and then she decided to change tactics. She started role-playing as me. The worst part is that she seemed to believe it was real, that those things had actually happened to her, even when she was quoting me word for word. Things I'd told her only hours before were now part of her life. It was like she was trying to absorb me or something, to take over my history, to make my life a part of her. Yeah, I really didn't want to talk to her again after that. I ignored future attempts she made and eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought she might finally move on. But then I started getting more friend requests on everywhere. They're still sitting there unanswered because I know if I delete them, she'll somehow find a way to seek me out elsewhere. Lily and I met nearly 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights. And even then, it's only the stuff I knew about for sure. A lot happened behind my back. I just know it did. The scariest thing that ever happened to me happened while I was at summer camp. I used to go there every summer. I'm a boy and I really enjoyed it. I looked forward to it as well, and when my parents dropped me off, I was so excited I barely even said goodbye to them. I ran off immediately to try and get myself involved in the various activities. When I was 15 years old, I even got the opportunity to be a counselor myself. It was great, actually. I had been going there yearly and knew the place inside and out. I was generally seen as pretty responsible. Being a counselor meant I was allowed to take out canoes whenever I wanted to. I especially loved canoeing, so this was a really big plus for me. Being a counselor, though, was much harder work than I'd initially thought it would be. A lot of the younger boys were brats, of course, and it was difficult trying to control so many kids at once. I had to break up several fights and make sure kids were going to bed when they were supposed to, and help care for them when they got hurt. I also had to make all their schedules as well. It was real tough work. I guess I never realized that I was just like them when I was their age. I finally got a break one day when I asked to be let off the nature hike roster. I had been working so hard that the supervisors decided I needed some rest. I decided I was going to spend the day doing the only thing I could do that would get me completely away from any kids. I decided to go out on the canoe. The camp that I worked in was by this nice, beautiful, long river. No sooner had I set out, making sure I was going the opposite way of the nature hikes, than I felt a supreme sense of relief. The trees were so beautiful on each side of the river, and I got such a good view of the many hills around the camp. The water was calm and still that day too, so it was a very easygoing experience. I was now alone in this empty area. It was pretty quiet for the most part, other than the frequent buzzing of what I assume were cicadas, or the occasional cry of a loon. Loon cries can be a bit unnerving if you've never heard one, but at least I could figure out what they were. With the echoing sound of the river valley, though, It made their cries seem so much more eerie. When I had been rowing for a long time, I began to hear a different noise. It sounded as if someone were possibly chopping a tree or something. I was surprised when I heard this, but I wasn't really worried. If I had accidentally wandered onto anyone's property, I would just explain myself and leave right away. My canoe began getting closer and closer to the noise as I kept on rowing. Eventually, I was able to hear the original sound. There was definitely someone chopping something. I became intrigued. Maybe someone was building something out here. It wasn't too long before I eventually was able to make out some movement up ahead of me. There was someone in the woods on the left side of the forest, but I couldn't quite tell what they were doing. At first, I tried to make it out by just squinting, but then I recalled that I'd brought some binoculars with me. I took them out. This was a bit of a pain. Obviously, it's difficult to look through a pair of binoculars while also trying to control a canoe. In fact, it gave me a bit of motion sickness. Eventually, though, I did get a view of the man who was up on the hill. He appeared to be chopping a log on the ground. I realized it was nothing too important, but figured the man probably owned the area and decided to go ahead and turn back around. However, just before I had decided to put my binoculars down, I saw him swing the axe into this log. Then he moved away. I had to do a double take to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. There was a man lying on the log, with the axe firmly embedded in his chest. I dropped the binoculars into the canoe, afraid for my own safety. The man was pretty far away, but if I could see him through the trees with my binoculars, it was possible he could see me way out in the open on the river. I was thankful the river was calm at least, as I frantically paddled my way back towards the camp. The return trip was a nightmare. The peaceful sounds I'd heard on my way down the river no longer seemed so peaceful. Every loon cry made my heart jump. Every sound of an animal moving through the trees made my heart race. I kept on thinking it could be that man, that he knew I'd seen what he was doing. If he was willing to do that to whoever that person was, what was he willing to do to me? It took me a few hours to get back, but boy was I so relieved when I did. I told my supervisors what I'd seen, but they immediately dismissed me. They told me I'd probably misconstrued what was going on. I was looking through binoculars on a canoe through trees, to be fair. Besides, it would be nearly impossible to find someone in those hills if something really had happened. A bit cavalier if you ask me, but I really had no choice but to accept what they told me. I did continue going back to summer camp until I went off to college, but I never again went off on my own for any reason. I live in a city in central Ohio that has a fairly big college I live next to. I actually attended a different college than the one I mentioned though, and had to make a 20-minute drive from the city to that college. I also worked nights as a pizza delivery man in the city and surrounding suburbs. One night, I had an order in the town where the college I go to is located, which is a smaller suburban city northwest of where I actually live. This call occurred during what my coworkers and I referred to as the dead hour, which is just before the shop closed at 1 o'clock in the morning. I begrudgingly took the pizza, hopped in the car, and plugged the address into the GPS. As I did so, I noticed that this house was located off a back road in what looked to be an absolutely abandoned area. Not thinking too much of this though, I drove up Route 315 I-70 East and exited. After passing through downtown, the cemetery, and the college, I drove through some subdevelopments and then onto an even smaller road, at the end of which the house was located. The GPS notified me that I had arrived at my destination, but to my surprise, as I looked on, the house was completely boarded up. I noticed there was a small shed in the back of the house that had a tiny window, and there was a flickering light in that window. At this point, almost every red flag was going off in my head. Still though, I knew my hard-ass boss would be pissed if I chickened out from the delivery, so I proceeded toward that mysterious shed. As I approached, I heard some rustling in the bushes next to the driveway. Then I heard a man whisper, "Here they come, Billy. 45, 45." At that point, a man leapt out of the bushes, and two other men jumped out of the shed. They were all carrying knives, and were wearing these long robes and white masks. I immediately took off sprinting, and made it back to my car just in time. One of the assailants actually managed to slit my arm with his knife as I escaped. I could see them standing in the middle of the road as I drove away, looking absolutely pissed. I shot out of there down that abandoned road at 90 miles per hour, and I finally arrived back in the shop. When everyone got a good look at my bloodied up arm, they were shocked. After explaining everything that happened, we contacted the police, and they dispatched a few officers to the house. When they got there, of course the assailants were long gone. They found some strange drug paraphernalia in the shed, some ropes, and a bunch of other strange equipment as well. What they were to be used for, well, let's just say I have a bit of a hunch. This happened when I was about 14 years old. I had just started babysitting for a family in my neighborhood. They had two kids, a boy who was 10 at the time, and a girl who at the time was 8. They were great kids to babysit, actually. They got along really well with each other without fighting, and always did what I asked of them without any complaining. Before I launch into what happened, I'm going to give you some background information about this family's home, so you can understand just why I was so freaked out. This house is situated pretty far back in my neighborhood, on this little side street just off the main road that runs through the neighborhood. The houses are in a cul-de-sac, so there's not a lot of traffic down this road at all. Usually the only people who ever come are mailmen and people who lived in those 3 houses that were there. The street itself was not very long, so there was only space for 3 houses on each side of the street that weren't in the cul-de-sac. Essentially, despite being in a large neighborhood, the street that this house was situated on was very quiet and sparsely populated. If you didn't live in this area yourself, you might not even ever know that this street existed. It was a fall Friday night. I'm pretty sure it was late November, just after Thanksgiving, I believe. I arrived at the home around 6 p.m. The kids were already sitting down eating dinner when I got there. The parents told me they expected to be home around midnight or so. They also made a joke about how the kids had the whole street to themselves, since all the other families that lived there were out of town for Thanksgiving. The parents left, the kids finished eating, and went outside to play in the cul-de-sac area. I remember locking the front door and taking the keys outside with me. The kids played and had fun on their scooters for about an hour. I rushed them back inside after, though. For some reason, I felt really on edge as the kids were playing outside. I chalked this feeling up to knowing we were alone on these streets, since everyone else who would be there was out of town. After the kids finished playing outside, we went to play in the basement instead. I remember locking the front door once we were back inside, and putting the key down on the kitchen counter. I double-checked the front door as well before going downstairs to the basement to join the kids. I was super vigilant about checking the doors because I had watched so many scary movies where a babysitter forgets to lock the door and some crazy murderer bursts into the home. As I was playing with the kids down in the basement, though, I began to get that unsettling feeling again. It didn't quite feel like we were being watched. It was more like that feeling you get when you know something's about to pop out in a scary movie. You're just anticipating it on the edge of your seat, with the tension at its absolute highest. The feeling was stuck on me the entire time we were in that basement, but again, I could only chalk it up to knowing the entire street was empty. The clock struck 10, and it was time for the kids to go to bed. We went to the top floor of the house, where the kids' bedrooms were situated. The house was set up so that when you open the front door and come inside, you're standing in the foyer, with the steps to go up to the top floor directly in front of you. If you're standing in that foyer, you can see all the way up the stairs into their bedroom. So the kids are in the bathroom, brushing their teeth and doing their nightly routine, when all of a sudden, I hear a car pull up into the driveway. I figured maybe it was their parents coming home super early, and I expected to hear the garage door open soon after, but that sound never came. I rushed over to the girl's bedroom window and peeked out her window to see what was going on. There was indeed a car in the driveway, and I could see a figure in the car, but the headlights were turned off, despite it being 10 p.m. and pitch black outside. Okay, well, maybe it was just someone who got lost in the neighborhood and was using the driveway to stop and get their bearings before heading back out on the road. I left the girl's bedroom and headed back to the bathroom where the kids were. All of a sudden, though, I heard a knock on the front door. I turned around and noticed the man now standing there, holding a pizza box. There are 2 long windows on either side of their front door, so I had a very clear view of this guy, and I knew he had a clear view of us as well. Immediately, I felt that familiar, eerie feeling I'd been feeling all night long. I asked both of the kids if one of them had ordered a pizza behind my back for some reason, but they both said no. The kids had always been very honest and wouldn't lie about something like that. They wouldn't even order a pizza without asking me, so I knew they must be being truthful. Normally, I would have gone downstairs to see what this guy wanted myself. Maybe he simply had the wrong address and I could point him in the right direction. But there was a little voice in my head screaming, "Don't go downstairs. Do not open that door." I could see some inconsistencies even from where I was already. The guy wasn't wearing a uniform that looked like he worked for any pizza company. Normally, they would be doing that, or at least have a hat with a company's logo on it or something, or at least somewhere on the bag. This guy just seemed off. He was in his late 30s or early 40s, and he looked super disheveled. His shirt was wrinkled, his pants were filthy and ripped up, and he had this ratty black baseball cap that was pulled down super far so that his eyes were covered. He was also grinning very aggressively. I thought this guy's teeth might shatter in front of me because how hard he was grinding them together. At this point, the kids noticed him as well and started asking why this random guy was here. I told them to go back to their rooms and lie down so no one could see them. The boy rushed to his room, and I walked the girl to her room. I looked out the window at that car again. I took note that the car didn't have one of those pizza delivery car signs on top either, which all the pizza companies in my town required delivery drivers to have. Now, I was fairly confident of my initial intuition. This guy was not a pizza delivery guy. The girl climbed into bed. I went back out of her room and shut the door, and sat down at the top of the stairs so I could keep a close eye on this man. I tried to stay calm so as to not upset the kids, even though I was freaking out on the inside. He was just standing there absolutely still, holding the pizza box in one hand and grinning that teeth-shattering grin. Even though I couldn't see his eyes because of his hat, I could tell from the feeling that he was staring dead at me. Without even trying to check that I wasn't looking anymore, he began to jiggle the door handle while still grinning. I suddenly thanked God I was so psychotic about making sure the front door was always locked. When he noted it was, he stopped jiggling the handle and resumed staring at me. If I was in this situation now, I probably would have called police immediately, but being only 14 and fairly new to babysitting, I was paralyzed with fear. It felt like if I took my eyes off him for just a moment, when I looked back, he would be standing at the base of the stairs. After another 5 minutes of this stare down, he literally started walking backwards off the porch without once breaking eye contact, legitimately just walking backward toward his car, while staring daggers at me. I rushed to the parents' bedroom, which also had a view of the driveway. I knelt down in front of the window and peeked out, expecting to see the man climbing back into his car. Instead, the man was nowhere to be seen. His car was still there, though. I returned to my perch at the top of the stairs, half expecting to see him at the door again or worse. He was nowhere to be seen. After about 30 minutes, I heard a car start up outside. I ran back to the parents' room, knelt down out of sight again, and noticed the car and the driver. The man was sitting in the driver's seat, still grinding his teeth. He also didn't turn the headlights on. He shifted in reverse and began silently backing out of the driveway, grinding his teeth the entire time. Just before he drove off, he turned his head, and I swear to God he made direct eye contact with me. I still couldn't see his eyes because of his hat. but it was so disturbing to me. He shouldn't know where I was inside that house. The parents' bedroom was the farthest window to the right. The lights in the room were off, and I was kneeling down as well. He didn't spend any time scanning the windows either. His head just snapped exactly to where I was. It was like he could sense I was looking at him. After I had time to calm myself down and collect myself, I started replaying what had just happened in my head and came to the following conclusions. 1. The guy was obviously not a pizza delivery guy. 2. Those 20 minutes or so that elapsed between when he walked backwards off the porch and to when he got back into his car were probably spent walking around the whole house checking all the doors and windows to gain entry. He clearly had malicious intent. Maybe he wanted to rob the house, or maybe he wanted to do something sinister to me and the kids. Either way, this guy was some bad news. I'm glad I trusted the voice in my head. I think he probably just found some random pizza box outside and tried to pose as a delivery guy to get me to open the door for him. There are still parts of the story that are confusing to me though. If he really wanted to get inside, why didn't he just grab a rock or a brick or something and throw it through the big window? I mean, I'm very glad he didn't, obviously. But I just thought it was a bit odd that he'd check the doorknobs and then give up immediately after discovering they were locked. Maybe he felt like that would make too much noise or something. Why did he walk backwards off the porch? To preserve eye contact? To intimidate me? Who exactly was this guy? I wonder if that feeling I felt earlier in the night was because he'd been watching us the entire time. Why did he pick that house specifically, given it was on a secluded street that almost no one would have known was there? There were 50 or so other houses you had to pass to even get to this one. And it's not like the area I live in is super affluent either. I don't know, maybe he was just on drugs or some crazy vagrant. So I'm a pizza delivery girl. Easy enough. I was at work around 9:30 p.m. when this guy called in using a very whispery, breathy voice. I did my usual. "Thank you for calling Pizza Hut. This is Karen. How are you doing tonight?" After the usual exchange of small talk, I found out he was ordering for delivery. He was a new customer, so I had to put in all of his information fresh. I didn't notice anything weird initially. He told me he had a coupon for a pizza and asked if I could give him the discount. I told him I had to grab my manager so we could take care of that for him. He asked for me specifically to take care of him after I came back from dealing with my boss. I discounted him for his coupon and he thanked me. Here's where it started to get weird. He stopped me mid-sentence and told me I had a very nice-sounding tone of voice and he just loved to hear me talk. "You should be a disc jockey," he said. I was a little bit weirded out, but I tried to stay professional. I told him that was very sweet of him, and I would consider it in the future. "I'd listen to your radio station. Thank you for taking my order tonight. I'll stop by your store and see you sometime soon, Karen." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but that isn't true. I noted that this man lived in an apartment complex. What I didn't realize is I'd taken his complex's address and not his individual apartment number. Not 5 minutes later, the man called back, and my coworker Bob answered the phone. I learned after the fact that he had asked for me by my full name. I picked up the phone and did my usual greeting, and he reminded me that I'd forgotten to ask his apartment number. I changed the information for him, but before I could hang up, this was our conversation. "Hey, Karen? Karen? Yes, sir, how can I help you? Are you doing all right?" "Yeah, I'm great." "Good. I'm gonna hang up now. See you soon." Bob had heard the whole story and told my boss to have my male coworker take the call instead of me. When Bob came back, the very first thing he said to me was that the man had been asking where I was the entire time. Okay, so I get there, right, and I knock on the door, and he says in this weird voice, "Come in." I'm not about to go into this random guy's house, though, so I knocked again, and he opened the door with this big smile on his face. When he saw it was me, though, it just dropped instantly. I greeted him, and he said, "Oh, where's Karen?" I told him you weren't going to be able to make it, and he got so angry. After I took his money and gave him his food, he asked how you were. I told him you were doing all right, and he just said, "Good." Karen is a sweet girl. Tell her I'll see her soon. The fact that he asked the driver to come inside and that he was expecting me really creeps me out. Maybe he's just a lonely guy who wants someone to talk to, but still, I'm gonna add one more creep to my list. For my first job, I worked as a pizza delivery driver and dishwasher at a mom-and-pop pizza shop. The shop was within walking distance of my apartment, which I had just gotten a loan. The shop was owned by a foreign man, his 2 nephews, and another friend of theirs. I was the only female in the entire building. The owner asked me to change into my work shirt the first day in the walk-in freezer. I declined and put it on in the bathroom instead. He supervised me delivering pizzas and put his arm around my chair, told me to join him and the workers after work for drinks. I politely declined, as I wasn't even old enough to drink. Then he began to ask if I had a boyfriend, which I did at the time. I told him yes, and that he lived in another state. He then offered his worker to sleep on my couch because he didn't have a place to stay. Didn't even consult me. Obviously, I protested and declined. He also told me he knew my boyfriend's name, which I'd never told him before. As time continued to go on, things began to get even weirder. The owner would sometimes take me out back, where there were no cameras, and scold me for not pouring bleach onto the dishes I was washing. I told him that you can't do that, but he didn't seem to care. He would take me out back after my shift and compliment my eyeglasses and tell me how beautiful I was. I would say thanks, hurry away, and drive home. One time, he even came up behind me as I was washing dishes and licked the back of my neck. He then proceeded to tell me that since I lived alone, which I did not inform him of, I should be very careful. He stated he knew the exact layout of my apartment because his friend lived nearby. I told him I had a roommate at the time, which I didn't. He chuckled and told me he knew I was all alone and that he was going to break into my apartment one of these nights and attack me. I was completely stunned. I had 4 deliveries waiting for me to drop them off that night. On my way out the door, his nephew muttered something about me being a girl. I threw the bags into the car, promptly pulled over, and had a panic attack. I dropped all 5 pizzas off and whatever else I was delivering at the very first house I arrived to. I really couldn't give a fuck. I rushed home to my apartment, called my mom, and sat in the kitchen with a hammer for safety. Someone began to knock on my front door. I wasn't brave enough to look out and see who, but I already had a feeling who it was. The pizza shop number then began to call me repeatedly. I'd left my eyeglasses in the shop apparently, and had their pizza bags still. My dad went to the store instead of me, gave them their bags back, and threatened the owner, saying he had no problem going to jail if they continued to bother me. My dad retrieved my glasses. Months later, I ran into that guy's nephew at my college campus, and he proceeded to just stare at me while we passed each other by, and continued to stare at me from then on. After these incidents, I got a huge 100-pound American bulldog to keep me safe. She did so very well until the day she unfortunately passed away. That pizza shop is still open for business, and I'm still living in the same apartment. Needless to say, though, I never order pizza from that shop anymore. Right outside my apartment, smoking a cigarette, an unknown person snuck around a corner and sprayed me with pepper spray while I was looking down at my phone. I could make out a tall, thin man with a backpack rushing away with his hands in his pockets before I lost the ability to keep my eyes open altogether. There were no other people on the sidewalk in either direction. I hadn't seen the man's face. He didn't say a single word or try to take anything from me or grab me. He didn't even stick around to watch me be messed up. He just sprayed me in my eyes and walked away like nothing ever happened. I'm thankful I was able to feel for my keys and get back into my building. I started to realize that I could very easily have permanent damage if I couldn't wash this out of my eyes fast. I couldn't even find the key to my studio. That's how blind I was. I was starting to not be able to breathe. I rushed up the stairs and pounded on every door I could feel until my neighbor, who I'd never met before this moment, opened up the door for me. She let me into her bathroom and tossed water on me everywhere. I felt so terrible for just commandeering her space and bringing that horrid smell into her home. I'll be eternally grateful to that woman, though, for helping me and calling the police. They never found the guy. I'm wondering if this was just random, or if this guy was waiting for me in particular. I still have no idea why he did that to me.